I think we're live here. Welcome to our open faith discussion at Talk of Christ, Faith, Family, and Adventure. And today our discussion will be focused on faith and on family a little bit, as we're going to talk about women in the workplace, kind of what are there religious and faith reasons or doctrinal reasons for women to be at home. Marty, why don't you start? This kind of question came from you, and so you can start the discussion for us.
Okay. So I'm in the ex-Mormon space. A lot of women feel that they were taught to stay home with their children, and have maybe more kids than they would have, or not spend any effort on their career, and they regret it now. And so my question is this something they were doing and it was a good thing and they just can't see the good in it? Is it something, was it doctrinal that they should have done it, or should have they been living a more authentic life where they should have been working in the workplace if they want to, and it was never doctrinal that they should have not pursued their career? Like, was this taught from church or not taught? It definitely is culturally there. I think we would all agree with that. Is it a cultural thing that needs to be fixed, or is it doctrinal? I guess I'd be curious to know.
I got opinions for days if we're open to that. So my understanding, or at least my observation, is, like in my youth or whatever, this was pushed fairly hard at church and by general authorities, like in general conference talks as well. They urged women to stay home. And I remember my mother, she was a stay-at-home mother. She did have a college degree, but she chose to stay home. And that was valuable, and she, took pride in that she did that. And, I see a lot of value, and I have noticed a lot of good things there. But as the culture has, and also, like you said, it's cultural, but I don't think it's strictly church culture. It's also, maybe worldly, but I'm only an American. So I think it's American culture as well has shifted on that question quite a bit in the last, 20, 25 years. So I think along with the cultural shift of the country, a lot more women are going to work. And I would kind of argue that, the way the economy has shifted, it's almost essential sometimes to have a two-party or a two-parent income, depending on what kind of job you have. If you make a ton of money by your lonesome self, awesome. But a lot of couples are finding it necessary to have two incomes. I'm actually personally, we're entering that phase now. My wife has been a stay-at-home mom, but I'm a art director / graphic designer, and not to disclose too much, but we need to make more money in order to move forward in life. And there's only so much I can make. So she's actually going to nursing school, which she's wanted to do for a long time. And I applaud her in that, and we're going for it. And I think the church has backed off on two things that are related to women's issues in the last, like I said, 20, 25 years. One is the women working. I think they've realized it's situational, and you need to, assess your financial situation and your needs as a family, and then make that choice based on that. And then also birth control, which I don't know if we wanted to bring up, but that used to be kind of hard. That was a little before my time, I'd say, but I think even more so, they've completely, at least in my experience, gotten out of that conversation whatsoever. Because I know back in like the 80s and 70s, they were kind of strong on that. Like you said, like, hey, you need, like, it's the edict of the church to multiply and replenish the earth. You should be having as many kids as the Lord allows, and go. But so those are the culture. And as far as doctrinal goes, I think it's not, as far as my scriptural study has produced, I don't think it's actually doctrinal, other than it's an interpretation of doctrine, of the multiply, replenish the earth. And the Mormons, for some reason, have always had have a ton of kids type of doctrine, not doctrine, but a teaching that I guess it's some sort of interpretation of, we need to get as many church members as possible. And, there used to be polygamy, and we justify that somewhat for saying we needed to multiply the members of the church or something. So I don't know if there's any actual doctrine, like literal, like from the scriptures doctrine, but it was definitely anyway. And
just to go down that road, Marty, I appreciate the question. And I think that it would be interesting, like, just on a personal note here, those are the five of us here who, how many have the woman from our home, either our wives or Marty in your case, is working outside the home or otherwise has or does work outside the home or will be or whatever? I just want to kind of vote. So I think, so we've got the four of us guys. Marty, you're at home. Why are you at home? You're muted, by the way.
Okay, so I graduated. I have an engineering degree, and we did our family planning so that I could graduate before we had our first baby. And then it was just always the plan to stay home with them. And I wanted to do that. When we had two, I looked into working half-time, but ultimately decided I couldn't justify the daycare costs. So it was always, had a heavier decision-making on me than, say, church influence. I have less of a mothering personality than a lot of my peers. And so I feel like there are some women that are just amazing mothers and they are able to make that a full-time job. I don't feel like I excel there and I waste a lot of time. So I think you can make motherhood a full-time job and be a super awesome mom. And that is also not, what's the word for it? It's not admired as much as I believe it should be. But then that's not me either. I always aspire to that, and I always feel like I fall short. But I do keep my kids alive.
What do you feel like has been the impression you've received from when you were a member of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, as far as whether this was doctrine, whether it was cultural? What was your impression?
About like number of family, like number of kids, or
no,
about
yeah. I mean, whichever. It's your question. I'm just kind of turning it back on you for a second to say, I would say that
I got the impression that good, better, best would be to be home with the kids. It's not bad to be a working mom, but if you're going to aim for the best would be to stay home for sure. This was my impression.
And did you feel like that was a cultural thing or a doctrinal thing?
It was coming from the prophets, so I would say doctrinal. Yeah, that's what I would thought it was. Yeah. Now looking back on it, I mean, it's all cultural in my opinion. So I don't have like a doctrinal truth of it. Kind of. I take that back because I think there are some underlying truths. I do not regret the number of kids I had, for example, and I feel like I may have not had this many kids had I not been brought up in the Mormon faith. And so I'm grateful for that. That's something I'm grateful for, because knowing my personality, I don't think I would have prioritized that as high as I should have. And I would have regretted it later, if that makes sense. Like when it was too late to have maybe 4 kids. So I fall a little bit more conservative on this to some of my ex-Mormon peers, because there's a lot of them that feel like they would have had less kids and had a career. And I've always felt like that family career balance, people get burnt out in their careers and they go, why am I doing this? It's a rat race. But I don't feel like your family, you get to keep them for your whole life. And I think that's more valuable still. So anyways, what was the other part of your question? Whether it was doctrinal.
I'm sorry. I got away from the Zoom screen and couldn't unmute myself. No, I just wondered what your feeling on it was. And then you probably saw the family proclamation pop up there for a second on the screen. I think that if there is any kind of, Latter-day Saint doctrinal position, I think it would be found in the family proclamation. And so that's what I was looking to share here. And of course, this came out, I think, 1995 or something. And so that was after there had already been a push towards, the culture was already shifting, I think, towards women working outside the home and other things. But we do have these sentences here that, right down here: by divine design, fathers are to preside over their families in love and righteousness and are responsible to provide the necessities of life and protection for their families, mothers are primarily responsible for the nurture of their children. In these sacred responsibilities, fathers and mothers are obligated to help one another as equal partners. Disability, death, or other circumstances may necessitate individual adaptation. And then extended family should lend support when needed. Any thoughts on the doctrine found there from any of you?
So I just I feel like that supports kind of what I was thinking, like in Corey's situation, he's saying, well, financially, they're kind of needing another worker in the house. So that would be kind of an exception or to the rule. But ultimately, if you can afford it, then it would be better for the women to stay in the house, I think is supported by that. Anyway, that's my opinion.
Maybe I'll hop on a little bit. Whenever we talk about doctrine, people want to think like there's this doctrine of the church and it's doctrine that has to be followed, particularly people in the church. Like, well, is that doctrine? The base of the word doctrine is just a teaching. And I think trying to get down to whether something's done, because something could be considered doctrinal now that wasn't 100 years ago, and vice versa, right? Polygamy, right? That's doctrinal, but obviously it's not something we're doing now. So was it doctrinal in the sense that it's a teaching? For sure. And I think you're getting a lot lighter version there in the proclamation of the family. There've been a lot of general authority quotes, pushing people towards, hey, the man's responsibility is to be out there. Women should be at home. I don't think in the proclamation, right, we have that the women should be nurturing. It doesn't say anything about what that nurturing consists of. Nurturing at the home, not working. Could nurturing be providing daycare while I go to work and then coming home and I'm able to be with the children, right? So there's a lot of interpretations there. So if we go away from, what is something that we would consider God is saying this is a doctrine that someone has to follow, going back to what Corey was saying, right? Scripturally, there's nothing there that's saying that, women should stay at home, except for the fact that a vast majority of the scriptures come from a time where it was very patriarchal, right? It's only within the last, 50, 60 years where women have really come to this, hey, we need to be on equal footing in all things in society. Before that, talking biblical times, women were considered property. And so if we're looking at from the proclamation of the world, and again, it gives like these caveats, I don't even think you can go so far as to say that it's pushing women to have to stay at home. Unfortunately, and I think this is where the cultural aspect comes in, I think a lot of times it's being interpreted that way. So I actually have the opposite situation of what my brother Corey has, is that when me and my wife, she's from Russia, and so the first little while, she didn't even have a green card, and we were finding our own ways to work, but we both were working up until January of 2020 when she left her work. So now she's moved into a space of being more of a stay-at-home mom where, for a decade of our marriage, more than a decade actually, she was working side by side with me. Most of the time it was part-time, less hours than I was working, but we had those dual incomes. And actually, she asked me about an hour before we hopped on here what we were talking about today. And I discussed with her a little bit what some of her experiences were, and she can correct me after this if she watches this, and then maybe I'll come back on and have to revise some of this. But from my experience in Relief Society, it's definitely talked about, especially those that have made similar choices to like what my mom made, where she had a degree, but she's chosen to stay at home. Not to say that my mom had this position, but people that never really had experience in the workplace outside of working jobs to help put themselves through college or something like that. They tend to lean more towards, hey, this is a sacred divine calling. And from her perspective, right, she sees this as they're getting a lot of fulfillment out of this because they see the husband being fulfilled from going to work and having this financial success, and no one wants to look back and say like, I'm at home, of course I have my children, but there's no real value tied to that from society, and so they see this fulfillment coming from this divine mandate that I should rear the children, and that's my responsibility here. She did say that oftentimes she felt a little out of place, in Relief Society when a good majority of people were in a different situation than she was, where she was working and they weren't. And this is where their experiences that they were sharing were coming from. And again, now that she's kind of on the other side, right, where there's time to maybe do play dates or something like that, she says that oftentimes she's still acclimating to this new way of, having all this time, that she's finding it hard to relate sometimes to some of the things that these older women have been doing, right? The way they've been leading their lives for the last 10 years, when hers used to be, she said, I was very proud, all right, of being a working mom and also being a good mom. Like, I come home, and she said for a long time that it made her a better mom, because this time away from her children, she felt like she had to cherish every moment with the children. She didn't get sick and tired of them. It wasn't this, oh, they've been nagging me all day. It's, this precious time I have with them before I have to go to work tomorrow and drop them off at daycare. Where now, when there's more time, it's not so much that, she doesn't care as much, but with that much more time and being that much more in their presence, it can be hard to cherish it as much. Just some thoughts there.
So I want to bring Joey in for a second, and then I'll make a comment maybe. But Joey, where do you come at this? We're talking from this, how it's taught in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. What do you hear about women working outside the home in your faith?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So for context, I was raised a member of the LDS Church, so my own experience resonates a lot with Corey's experience. And I guess that would be Jake's experience too. They grew up together. My mom was a stay-at-home mom. My dad worked and brought home the bacon. And like culturally, like that's like what I expect, I guess. And so I have to fight against that a lot in my own household. Fight against my own sort of cultural tendencies, I guess. My wife is a speech therapist. She does work outside the home. She's worked for the school district for a while as a speech therapist. She's currently working for a couple of hospitals in the Valley as a speech therapist. She does not work full time, nearly so, but not quite. She's probably around 30, 35 hours. So she's home when the kids are home most of the time. And that's one of the things, like when our kids were born, she scaled back her hours quite a lot to be home more with the kids. I am, as we've already discussed many times on these videos before, I'm a fairly conservative evangelical Christian. And so on the conservative end of that spectrum, I think what Marty was saying a minute ago, like good, better, best, probably the best is for someone to stay home and be with the kids full time. So as we've been talking, I've been thinking about, there was a really helpful sermon from my pastor. Oh, I should have found the sermon for you guys, but he preached from Proverbs 31 and about an excellent wife is what Proverbs 31 is about. Can I share my screen? Oh gosh, wrong window.
I think you should be able to. Let me know if you can't. There you go.
How's that?
Mm-hmm.
Here's Proverbs 31. So an excellent wife who can find, I'm not going to read the whole thing. I'm going to skip over portions of it, but an excellent wife who can find, she's far more precious than jewels. So the context of this whole passage is talking about an excellent wife and what are all the attributes of an excellent wife, right? And I've highlighted a few here. She considers a field and buys it. So now I don't know whether that means she would own the property. A minute ago, was it Jacob that said in the Old Testament, women were property? I don't know if that's 100% accurate. Can take umbrage with that, but here she's buying property, right? She perceives that her merchandise is profitable, right? She's buying and selling things in the market, right? She makes linen garments and sells them. She delivers sashes to the merchant, right? She looks well to the ways of her household and does not eat the bread of idleness. Her children rise up and call her blessed, her husband also, and he praises her. Right. So this is held up as like, this is a standard for who a woman should be. Right. And it's not, oh, she's barefoot in the kitchen and pregnant all the time, so that's an example from the Old Testament, right? How the Bible sees women. I did find some articles, so here's a passage in the New Testament, and both of these are from Paul. in this one, he says that the older women should train the young women to love their husbands and their children, to be self-controlled and pure, working at home, kind and submissive to their own husbands. And this is the kind of stuff that's like, the very conservative stuff that gets us in trouble with liberals. But here's another one. So I would have the younger widows marry, bear children, manage their households, and give the adversary no occasion for slander. So there's two, so point, counterpoint, right? We have this example of a woman in the Old Testament who's buying and selling merchandise. She's buying property, she's, and then we have these examples in the New Testament where prescriptive passages. The other examples from the New Testament, though, we have two women in the New Testament, Lydia and Priscilla, who are both held up as examples for other Christian women, and they both work outside the home. Lydia is I think she's called a buyer and seller of purple linen. I don't know what Priscilla does, but she works outside the home as well. So I think it is kind of like what Marty was saying, like a good, better, best. There are arrangements that work better and other arrangements that don't work as well, maybe. But are women forbidden to work outside the home? Absolutely not. The Bible doesn't say that women shouldn't work outside the home. So it's kind of, I think every couple, every family needs to kind of work out for themselves what's the arrangement we're going to have, and what do we feel is going to work the best for our family. But my pastor preached from Proverbs 31. And he had very personal stories about his and his wife's own situation. She is a nurse and works outside the home, sometimes late hours, weekends, nights, and he talked a little bit about, how they've worked together to make that work for their household. And so that sermon was a very valuable one for me, because it really made me stop and think, oh yeah, I'm kind of pre-programmed to think one way about where a man should be and where a woman should be. And I need to sort of deprogram myself, right, to think in ways more like how the Bible speaks about men and women. So that's.
Appreciate that. When I start to think whether something is doctrinal, I try to revert to, I'll be honest, I'm kind of reverting to my own, gospel of one, right? Or my own faith and what I believe about why God might give certain commandments or why we might teach certain things. Anyway, I drop back into a very Old Testament time when I'm evaluating the gospel sometimes, and I'm thinking, when surely in Moses's time and Abraham's time and Jacob's time, they are the patriarchs, they had their families. And of course, Abraham said, well, I've got to go off and do the computer programming today. You stay home with the kids. The truth is obviously that we have this very modern concept of working outside the home, meaning I'm going to go off and sit down near my boss and my coworkers, and I'm going to make something for, working for the man, create something in this business, and I'm going to be gone all day long. And then I'm going to come home with money. And it's just so
in a more agricultural context where every household was a farm. Right. I'm sure the men and the women were both out in the fields working like crazy all the time. You can't.
Only one generation from that.
Working from home meant hard labor, so yeah, you're right, Steve. We have this modern sensibility of like, I go to the office, she stays at home, but there was no such thing as an office,
right,
1,000 years ago.
Surely there was a lot of work that the men and the women would do together, and then some that they would do separately, but it was all very important. And the family depended on both the man and the woman doing work, and not just, but somehow when we came into a modern society with men going off to the factory and then later going off to the office, the women would apparently say, okay, and whether the men and the women worked together to decide, or whether the men just said, now you make the dinner and you do the dishes while I'm doing this. And then we got this segregated thing over the last couple 100 years. And to think that could be somehow biblical, doctrinal, seems silly to me, because that this type of society didn't exist in that kind of a scriptural setting back hundreds of years ago. So, but more like this idea of, as the Family Proclamation does say, there's something about, this leads to a discussion about just how different are women and men, right? and this is a completely different, it may open up a completely different area. And then also, how does this whole difference between women and men apply in teaching in the church, serving in the church? That brings us to another whole area, and so depends on where we want to go with this conversation. But this idea of men and women should help each other as equal partners seems very appropriate to me, and I think to everybody else. And then, as you've all said already, we all decide with our partners, what does that mean? Adam and Eve were helpmeets, both assigned to care for the garden. And I think that a good question to ask, and this is my own personal thought, when you're saying, should the woman of the household work outside the home, is to say, what is the reason and the purpose that that the man would go work outside the home or the woman would go work outside the home? Certainly there are purposes like providing for the family, that someone's got to do it. Someone's got to, do that kind of work. Does it have to be the man? Does it have to be the woman? I don't think it has to be either one, but somebody's got to do that. But then if the other person says, well, I also want to go work, do they want to do that in order to obtain more wealth and a different kind of lifestyle? How important is that? Or also maybe they just want to do it because they want to have a creative outlet. And personally, I think that finding ways for each of us to be more creative is an appropriate thing. So kind of the why are we working outside the home? What is it we're doing? I think are important questions that husband and wife should ask together to determine, whether they should be outside the home. That was a little bit of a rambling thought process. What reactions or thoughts do you have to that?
I had one thought in there. I don't disagree with you. I do kind of think, though, the church does teach a little bit. Like when you were talking about, it's more of like we have two people at the head of the family and we're dividing up responsibilities. The church is pretty clear about which one is to provide for the family, which one's to provide for the children. And I think that's where a lot of misconceptions, or not even misconception, the conception of women staying home with the kids comes from. I don't think it is coming out of the I don't know. And then the other thought I had is, as far as children are concerned, daycares do exist and they are still being taken care of. And I don't know, it's not like either of them are shirking that responsibility. They are giving them to some other trusted adult to watch over them while they are doing their thing. So
or grandparents or aunts and uncles,
sure.
or, in fact, the next sentence in that family proclamation said extended family should, lend a hand or support where appropriate. And so, yeah, what about those situations? I mean,
so in my personal experience, so I have gotten to the point where I only have one, I have a 3-year-old at home. The rest of them are in school full time. And so I've kind of re-entertained the idea of going and getting my first job after I've graduated. So it's a 10-year-old graduation degree. So I'm going to put my resume out there, and I'm really excited about it. I feel like it will help me become the best version of myself. I feel like I have a certain set of skills and I excel at a certain set, and that's where I want to put that's where I want to improve myself. And not that I can't improve myself with my kids. I remember one time my husband and I were talking about, I think, this very thing back when I had 2 kids and I only wanted to work half-time and nobody wanted a half-time engineer. So it just never happened. I just ended up staying home with the kids. And there's been studies done that parents that work away from the home have more quality time with their kids, one-on-one quality time. Probably kind of like what Jacob was saying, because when you're home with them all day, you never actually take 9 minutes out of your day or whatever to actually sit down and talk to them one-on-one. Whereas when you've been away from them all day, they will come home and they will play one-on-one with them. Whereas like I know I don't do that as successfully as I'd like to. And so I can totally see that improving in my life, but we'll see. I mean, I've come to the point where I want to try it out. And if I see that it is a detriment to our family, I'm totally willing to cut back hours or whatever and stay with them more. So anyway.
I have a couple thoughts on because I think part of this discussion too is like the church and their teaching on gender roles in general. And that, I mean, I've had a little bit of perspective on that, like I said, the last year or so since my wife started going to nursing school. I mean, we did that because COVID hit and I could work from home, and we're like, okay, there's an opportunity here. You can go do what you've, kind of wanted to do for a long time, because before it's not possible. Because here's the thing, yeah, like someone has to make money. You had kids, so you have to take care of them. Someone has to. And so, if you can afford fancy daycare, awesome, but we couldn't. So, that now kind of shifted to me. So we're kind of juggle 2 full-time people with, I got 4 kids. And so some days we're better at than others, but I have noticed, like, and I've had to fight the same things like Joey has. And some of the toxic part of it has come up a little bit where like, there are some things in the house that I was like, this is not something that I should do, or like, this is not something that like is my main responsibility. Like, laundry, making dinner and stuff like that. That's, I don't know, again, that's Mormon stuff, but it's also kind of like the American culture since like the 30s and onward. I don't know what it's like before that. It might have been kind of the same, but I've noticed now that we've switched that, like I have that in me. Like my mom was a stay-at-home mom, so I actually, like, maybe don't tell my wife this, but like there are some things that I feel like I'm actually better at nurturing in some ways for some of that, and some ways that I definitely have noticed that there are psychologically, and whether, I don't know if there's this like actual genetics or like it's just hundreds of years of like conditioning of the roles of men and women, but like men typically are more aggressive and risk takers. I don't know if that has anything to do with children, and women are more generally more nurturing and social. Not that they can't be aggressive and women and men can't be the opposite, but on the general spectrum. And so as far as like how that suits to rearing the children, like I found I can be nurturing and I can be all those things, but I have to hold myself back a lot and like be like, don't be so aggressive with your anger. And not that my wife doesn't get mad at my kids too, but I've noticed that when they've done something bad, generally they they want mommy and they don't want me. So, and maybe I'm just a jerk, I don't know, but like a booming physical man is weird. But anyway, one other thing is Orson Scott Card wrote something. He's like a sci-fi author, but he's a Mormon, and I can't remember what he was writing about exactly. It was one of his books, but had this little tirade in the middle of one of the books. And I was like, well, it seems like civilization, like the higher the civilization, the more it allows for men and women to have more equal roles, because like when you break it down to like the tribalism or whatever, like just the mere physicality differences between the two is more emphasized, where it's like men had like someone's going to go out and hunt and fight the wars, and like typically that's going to be some that's bigger and stronger, and on average men are bigger and stronger than women, so they had to do that. And women are burdened with bearing the children, like literally their bodies make them, and they have especially back in like thinking tribalism, like women had to give suck to the children, if you will. They are the source of nutrition, so it's just naturally kind of flowed from that kind of thing. But he says, as you get more advanced in civilization, like the differences, like physical differences, don't really matter, because like it doesn't matter if you're a computer programmer. All you have to do is be able to computer program. You could be a brain with 2 hands. As long as you can touch the keys, then anyone can do it. But we have,
I wonder if my wife could bench press more than me.
Yeah, I'm not saying there's not exceptions. I'm just saying
it's entirely possible she could.
On average. But anyway, I guess, sorry, I was going somewhere with that. I don't remember exactly where I was, but anyway, it was just I've noticed that I think what the church, this is kind of a separate topic, but really, so the church, I think what they've tried to fight against in like the 70s, 80s, and 90s is maybe I don't know, and this is debatable, but like how they see the gender role of femaleness, and it's kind of a fight with feminism, right? Where they're saying feminists, at least from the church's perspective, and kind of mine, maybe part of feminism is want to come in and say, hey, there's only like, this is a man's world, whatever it is in the 50s and 60s. And like the way you said you have value is by having a job. And because in American culture, especially, like, what's the first thing when you introduce yourself to someone? You say like, oh, I'm Bob, and what do you do for work? Like, this is the defining characteristic of your life, right? And so we said that's important, and women are like, oh, it's slowly devolved into like, I just stay at home and that's not important to society, therefore it doesn't have value. And so
as if that's not, as if raising
I
children,
think that needs to change.
yeah,
right.
Like
That and thankfully there's a whole feminist, group and contingency that says, wait a minute. Yeah, we are devaluing what women do when they're in the home by pushing so hard to say that women need to work outside. They don't. It's kind of this, if you want to be a mother and you want to raise children, we need to celebrate and praise that, because that is incredibly valuable, incredibly difficult, so yeah, keep going, Corey, though. I think you were still.
Well, I mean, just that, like I've seen, like I was going to say, like I've seen the value, because I've had to do a little more of like what I may have previously perceived as like the feminine role. And I've noticed like, man, this is a, not that I didn't know this before, because I'm not like some chauvinist, but like it's a lot of work, but like it's a lot of work, and it's hard and emotional, and to like keep it in check. Like it's a valuable role in society. And I do understand the church's push to be like, this role is, I think, what they're worried about vanishing. Not that women necessarily, I mean, maybe some people, but I don't think it was that women shouldn't be valued and can't work. It's that the value of someone staying home and providing nurture and care for the family. I think it kind of branched out of
Just the value of having a family,
yeah,
of having children, of raising them and taking care of them, so that we don't all just focus on careers and everybody grows up, goes to college, gets a career, focuses on their career, and then never does have or start a family and create, and perpetuate life. And the roles of, at least in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, an eternal family is a very significant part of our doctrine. And so, yeah, like you're saying, Corey, maybe it's important to recognize that the specific roles within the home or outside of the home aren't necessarily important and don't need to be assigned to a specific gender, so much as somebody needs to be spending that time nurturing the children. And as you said, there's a biological component to that. Women, have the babies and nurse the babies that lends towards that. And there's a biological component that men tend to be stronger. And so in the old days, the strength was part of going out and doing the hard labor and bringing home the bacon. But
well, and then also, like, if you're going to talk about a career and being able to forward your career by not having, I mean, I don't know, depends on how many kids you have, but if you do end up having more than like one kid, it is time consuming to be home with them. And it makes it so that if your time is spent there, it can't be on your career. So then if you're going to have someone that's going to be the main moneymaker, it does oftentimes fall on the men. Not that it's always falling on the men, but that sometimes I feel like some things are brought up as sexism, and it's just part of reality. And it shouldn't mean that everybody has to follow that cookie cutter thing, but it just happens. Like, it's okay to just see why it happens and not be mad about it and cynical about it, that it's just men keeping women down, I guess. I don't love that viewpoint.
It seems to me that, especially given the examples, Joey, that you gave from Proverbs and from the scriptures, that any given couple should be able to sit down and say, all right, what are your strengths? What are my strengths? If you have strengths of being really nurturing, caring, loving, and sympathetic with the children, and you love to be around them, then let's try to create an atmosphere where you get to spend that time with the children more. And if the other person is more of, I need some time to myself, I also need some time to be creative. I'm really good making linens and clothing, or I'm really good, solving problems, and I want to do programming. There's a lot of this. What is it that you want to do with your life and with your creativity? Let's value what is done in the home, but let's value each other's strengths and each other's desires and each other's creativity, and put all of that, as we focus on the strengths and creativity of each partner, we're going to get better results in the family across the board. And it doesn't need to be, well, this is my role because I'm a man, and that's your role because you're a woman, which doesn't make sense at all. I want to take this for the last few minutes into roles within the church, within the gospel, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints gets a lot of flack, attacks, if you will, about equality for men and women in their roles within the church. Joey, I want to start with you. What are your thoughts about the roles of men and women in the church? And then we'll open it up to everybody else.
Well, I mean, I'm the theological conservative, so I think the Bible's very clear that elders, presbyters, pastors, overseers should be men. The Bible's less clear about deacons. There seem to be several examples of deaconesses in the Bible. But I would, in general,
and there are examples of women receiving revelation and being prophetesses and prophecies, right? Like that's not a priesthood calling in your understanding, correct?
Right. Yeah. Spiritual gifts, I think. Yeah. And I mean, I think that the situation is complicated by your doctrine of the priesthood that gives men some special authority to do certain things. And, well, I mean, I should back up because obviously being an elder in a church gives a man special authority to do things. But we don't have a concept in our tradition of like priesthood blessings or, I don't know what else would be a good example.
Can you clarify that, Joey? Because like I think I didn't realize this until my mission, and I went and talked to like an evangelical. But like, can you explain kind of the differences between how you get the priesthood in like most Protestant faiths?
Well, what is the priesthood
or priesthood in general?
Right. Priesthood is just the office of being a priest. The priesthood is I don't know. Correct me if I'm wrong. I'm going to butcher it if I try to explain your doctrine, but it's an authority that's granted to you. It's magic power is the wrong way to put it, I guess. But you tend to speak about the priesthood in terms of the priesthood is the authority, and in a more like the priesthood is in the Catholic Church. We don't even talk about priesthood in the evangelical traditions. We don't have priests. We have elders. And so like in the Catholic Church, the priesthood, if you're talking about the priesthood, you're talking about the priests. You're talking about the men. You're not talking about the authority they have necessarily, or maybe you're talking about the office that they hold, I guess. But you're not talking about a special kind of authority that they have. So,
well, does it exist outside of like church hierarchy and organization? Because like, in the LDS church, there's this, and because we were talking about this in the chat, like the power to, give us, I know this isn't in other churches, but like the power to give like a healing blessing or something, like that's gray area right now in the LDS church. And we're realizing like, well, giving a healing blessing and like maybe even a baby blessing, like those aren't necessarily actual priesthood ordinances. I think women should be able to do that, but traditionally they haven't.
Participate in them or stand in. Yeah. That's more
there is a verse in the New Testament that talks about calling on the elders and having them pray over someone who is sick. But I don't think that's because only the elders are allowed to do that. I think it's just, like when you have to move, you call the elders quorum, but other people can help you move furniture. I would say all Christians can pray, men or women,
and the
young
power,
or old. And
the
prayer
power
works,
that heals,
no matter who you are, So
the power that heals and the power that performs miracles is faith, right?
I wouldn't even say that. It's God.
Well,
faith.
God is going to heal you or not. Like it. Yeah, I would say it even operates independently of how much like it. That's like the name it, claim it, prosperity gospel that, if you just have more faith, then you would be healed. And the fact that you're not healed is because you haven't had enough faith, evidently, I would say that's a very destructive way of thinking about things.
Clarify one more thing, because like maybe it's not in your specific faith, but you probably know more about general evangelicalism than maybe I do. But because like when I talk to people in my mission, like we told them about the priesthood, and they're like, well, it was a lot like what Marty said. Some of these like East Coast feminist Mormons are saying like, no, it's just something like you feel a call to it, and then if you feel like you are called to act in behalf of God, then that's your calling, and that's how you get priesthood, or the authority. Because I guess it might have come because we told them, like, well, the priesthood is the authority to act in the name of God or on behalf of God. And they're like, well, yeah, you don't have to have like someone lay on hands to do that. You just feel the calling. And I think that's akin to what Marty was describing, some of these more, feminist leaning LDS people were feeling.
I would say a calling, some personal feeling of that you're called by God to serve in that way is important. I don't know that we would ordain anyone to the office of elder without them feeling some kind of personal call. And it varies though. Like the more loosey-goosey, like non-denominational churches will ordain just about anybody, right? Whether they've even been to seminary or not, right? In my church, the Presbyterian Church in America, we're a lot more conservative, a lot more. We get a lot more serious. I think we are self-aware and can make fun of ourselves that we love books and we love learning and we love academics, right? My pastor has probably got a master's degree, at least from a seminary. And before being ordained, he has to present himself before a presbytery meeting, which is a body of elders coming from a bunch of local churches. There aren't a lot of Presbyterian churches in Utah, so our presbytery is actually combined with a presbytery in California, and so the meetings move around all over the place. Sometimes they're in California, sometimes they're here, but there'll be like 50 to 100 elders from almost as many different churches present at these presbytery meetings, and when they're ordaining a new elder, a new pastor to office in a church, they quiz the crap out of him. It's like they put him in front of the whole body and they just pepper him with questions, doctrinal questions, pastoral questions. Oh, if someone comes to you with this problem, how do you help them, right? How do you counsel them? Those sorts of questions, right? And they basically decide whether to ordain the guy or not. And so but it's actually a pretty rigorous process. Yes, in the PCA, it's only males that are ordained to office as elders. But then on the other end of that, what's the authority that he's given? Because he's not given, there's all sorts of authority he's not given, right? In our church, only elders baptize and give the Lord's Supper, bless the Lord's Supper. I don't know. I'm not convinced by some of the scriptural proofs that only elders should do those things. I think one of the main reasons we do it that way in our church is just to keep order in the church, so that you don't have, because I've heard of situations where, they'll do like pizza and root beer for the Lord's Supper, and things like that, or like we don't want men like baptizing their own kids in the bathtub at home, right? It's that sort of thing. So just for the maintenance of order and not chaos in the church, we say and I think it's in our church bylaws. It's not even in our doctrinal standards, basically, that only the elders should be baptizing and blessing the Lord's Supper. So I don't think they don't have any special authority to do those things necessarily. It's more just to keep order in the church. Although they are ordained as ministers of the word, and we think they are the only ones that should be preaching. And that's partly because they've been educated in preaching and they're good at it, right? They know how to rightly handle the word, and that's part of why they go through that rigorous, exam or whatever.
It feels to me like you're saying that a lot of the rules within your church surrounding men and women and their service within the church are certainly non-essential doctrines, that they have nothing really to do with individual salvation and justification, but more like stances of some kind of order, and that from one
tradition.
From one Protestant faith to another, you could forgive that they do this differently, and this is not a really big deal. And also, I would say that there are some rules within your own faith that you say, look, we have an elder or someone who wants to be an elder stand before the congregation, the presbytery, whatever, and there's this quizzing and this vote, And in general, we like them to be very knowledgeable, but the level of knowledge can be, subjective, right? So I'm getting this feeling that all of this is just kind of it feels important, but not essential. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, I would say that. It's definitely in the non-essential category. So case in point, I was not baptized by the pastor at the church where we were attending when I was baptized. I believe the guy who baptized me was an ordained minister, though, in the Southern Baptist Convention. But I'm not positive on that. And while we were there, it was very common for fathers to baptize their own kids. It was common for I had one of Janine's friends' boyfriend who she married, and he became a Christian, and he asked me to baptize him, and I baptized him. And I was not an ordained elder in the church at the time. And so, and I think I've had some conversations with the pastors in my current church, my current denomination, and just asked them, hey, so we have a rule here that says only elders should baptize. So if my friend who I baptized while I was not an elder, if he came here seeking church membership, would you re-baptize him? And the answer is no, we would not re-baptize him. His baptism was a valid baptism, even though it wasn't performed by an elder. We don't think baptisms are valid or not based on whether they're performed by an elder. We just think in our denomination, the way we would rather do things is orderly and not chaos. So it's not that being an elder makes that baptism any more valid or less valid. It's just that for the maintenance of order, we do it this way. So it's absolutely a non-essential. So if someone from another church who doesn't agree with us on this one point came and sought membership based on their baptism, which was done a different way, we would not turn them away. We would accept their baptism as valid and bring them right in the door.
Do you feel that you get some criticism in your religion, faith, and church about the roles of men and women? And do you think that criticism is valid, or how do you respond to that before we jump back into the Latter-day Saint faith?
Well, yeah. I mean, obviously this is controversial. We wouldn't be talking about it if it wasn't controversial. Yeah, we get pushback about, but I don't know if it's weird, right? Because I have not heard of, well, I guess here's the thing. If a woman wanted to be ordained, she would just leave our church and go join a liberal church. I mean, she's got options, and that's another thing I think that's complicated by you're the only true church, right? Catholics would have a bigger problem
I'm just going to point out how sad that option is, that you have to leave your faith community into order. That said,
right,
like flippantly. I mean, a lot of people said that about, what's that gal's name that tried to do in the LDS, Ordained Women Movement, Kelly, whatever.
Kate.
I can't think of her name.
Kelly.
Yeah, Kate Kelly. Yeah. So she essentially, I remember being one of these people, by the way, thinking, why don't you just leave? Like, if you're not happy with it, go away.
Well, but
I did not realize how hard a faith crisis was, how hard it was to leave your faith community, and how, I don't know, I guess I just have to point out how callous that is. It's like, well, she'll just go join a different church. And that's a lot harder, a lot easier said than done, I guess.
Well, you're thinking of that though, in terms of leaving the LDS church, which is the only true church. Leaving the Presbyterian Church in America is not leaving the only true church.
It's still your faith community though, right? Like the people you're going to church with every week.
So is it hard to leave one ward and go to another ward? I mean, people do that when they move.
That's true.
You're right. I shouldn't just blow off the whole, you're right. You've got people in your church who maybe you grew up with and they're like your best friends. That would be difficult. But you're not walking away from your whole faith tradition. You can go to a liberal Presbyterian church that holds the same Westminster Standard confession as the Confession of Faith, holds a lot of the same doctrine, and just ordains women to
if we can imagine a world where in the Latter-day Saint faith it was acceptable to do kind of some community shopping. Yeah, well, no, to do some ward shopping, like Joey has mentioned, and to find a ward that you're more comfortable in, because generally the people are a little bit more liberal, a little bit more conservative, or whatever. And I really don't feel comfortable in my ward, so I'm going to go to the neighboring ward. But I'm still part.
About the only option you have is like you can go to a singles ward if you're single, right? You can choose which ward you want to attend if there's certain like life circumstances or whatever. But
and
yeah,
and that's a little
you
more
can't
similar
find
to this
an
idea.
LDS ward that's more or less liberal or holds to slightly different doctrines because of the top-down rigid like structure of the LDS Church.
Well, I'd actually argue that the geographic location of wards gives some benefit, assuming that you don't live by people that think like you, because it forces people that don't fully agree to get together, and you can get the benefit of. Yeah.
And we've discussed that in another video, but the point simply is that when Joey says that if a woman feels like she wants and has been called to be ordained, she goes and joins another congregation, that's a little bit more like what we're saying. If you felt
maybe
like I don't really.
What if that liberal congregation also has a whole set of other beliefs that you don't like, and you actually do like the conservative congregation more? You just happen to believe that women should be able to be a pastor, just like you believe a woman should be able to be a CEO, for example. Like not as many women feel called to be like the CEOs of companies, but there are like a minority of them that do.
Yeah.
And why can't they? You know what I mean?
Well, I mean, the first thing I'll say to that is that there are just as many different denominations at all different levels on that spectrum as there probably are people who are looking for churches that are in Utah. Now, in Utah,
and
maybe
also,
not. Yeah,
Joey, couldn't she just go start her own, and it wouldn't be a big deal as much?
Right.
Like she just finds the one that's closest, and then just says, "We're going to start our congregation in this way," and you're not leaving the faith, and that is that's the rigidness and the problem and where we get the heavy attacks when we're talking about men and women in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, because the women who feel like women should be ordained to the priesthood, there's no place for that within the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. You can't just go start a ward where that's happening.
Right. There kind of is a place. There are like sub-communities within the larger community, but in terms of the top-down rigid, like doctrinal and policy setting, like structure of the church, there is.
Or you could just do the priesthood blessings. That's what a whole bunch of people I'm finding out do. I didn't know this until I
and there's been a whole push of, okay, what really are priesthood ordinances and responsibilities that should be scripturally, doctrinally assigned only to priesthood holders? And then what are the things that traditionally we have and customarily we have assigned to priesthood holders, but don't doctrinally or scripturally necessarily belong to them? And how can we get women more involved has been a big focus of push. And I've seen the church.
I was a witness for baptism.
My wife was a witness in the latest baptism.
Yeah, exactly. And they can be witnesses at baptisms, and not just live baptisms, but baptisms for the dead. The young women do the witnessing there as well. And I think more and more of that, I think the church is becoming aware that, we've previously assigned these responsibilities to young men or to men, thinking that men should do these roles, but they're not scriptural. And so, we start to see that stuff open up.
Well, one other question, real quick, one other question the church and pretty much all of Christianity probably needs to answer for itself. And I know there's some will hold tighter to literalism and some, a little looser, but like in the scriptures, like we're saying, well, there is some scriptural precedent for that. But then, if you, depending on your view of how scriptures came about, you can say, well, how much of that is, again, cultural influence from their time and place? Whereas like, does God really not hold women in the position that they could administer in the church? Like, is that really God's standard? Like, it's in the scriptures, so we're protected. It's like, but really, you really think God thinks that women can't give people blessings and hold authority? Because it seems very time and place cultural. And like in our current culture, and maybe this is my presentism, but it is hard for me to understand. Like, well, what is? I mean, come on, is God a sexist then? Like, what are we doing here?
I just want to make a comment about this. I don't know where it came from, so it's hearsay at this point. But I have heard it said that one of potentially, okay, even as I dive into this, I'm thinking to myself, all statements like what I'm about to say have the very strong potential of being completely disavowed in 10, 15 years. So I want you to know that I realize that. But it's an interesting thing to think about. Women biologically and very obviously have the laboring oar, if you will, of physical birth, of bringing life, physical life into the world. Every human being so far, or that in general, comes into this world through the laboring and the work of a woman. And that's how life starts physically. And the argument I've heard made that on the spiritual side, that men have the laboring oar and the role to help humans with spiritual rebirth. Now, specifically one man. It's very important to point out, everyone is spiritually reborn through the work and the labor, through the atonement of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. And in calling people to him and in performing certain ordinances that allow us to follow him and to accept his atoning sacrifice, men apparently throughout scripture and history have kind of that laboring oar of spiritually birthing, to be the rebirth of all of God's children. And I find that interesting. It doesn't necessarily mean that it will always be that way, but it's an interesting thought. I think I want to end it there. I thank you very much for participating in this conversation about.
Toss out some real-time follow-up.
Go ahead.
I just looked up. There is a denomination, a Presbyterian denomination called the EPC, the Evangelical Presbyterian Church. They are about a third the size of my denomination, but they do allow individual churches to decide whether they want to ordain women as pastors or not. So some churches in the denomination will say no to that, but other churches in the denomination are allowed to say, yes, we're going to ordain women, and they can put forward candidates or whatever. But they are conservative on like issues like homosexuality and abortion and things like that. And so they would probably, attending an EPC church would probably be very similar to attending my church on any given Sunday in terms of what they're teaching from the pulpit, how they believe on all sorts of, essentials and non-essential beliefs. So anyway, real-time follow-up. I don't know if there is an EPC church in Utah, though. There probably isn't one. So,
well, and
anyway.
As we mentioned before, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints seems to be opening up more and more roles and opportunities for women. I would also mention that from the beginning of church history, women have played an arguably priesthood role. It's been even called something akin to that in General Conference in the temple. We know that ordinances are performed in the temple that are performed by women in their role.
I was shocked by that, by the way. That shocked me. Yeah.
In their role as priestesses. And
it should be in regular church too.
And so it seems like there's a scriptural doctrinal basis so that if in the future, the Lord, the prophets, or whoever is necessary to make that change, makes a change, that women take a larger role and perform more in the way of priesthood ordinances, it wouldn't be a big surprise to, I think, many members of the church. And we wait for the guidance of those who have the keys to make those kinds of decisions, right? So, but thank you again for joining me on this conversation, and hopefully we'll find a great topic for next time. If anybody's watching this and you've gotten all the way to the end, if you've got some topics that you think we should be chatting about, chime them in on the comments. And if you want to join us too for an episode or whatever, please feel free to let us know. Reach out. Thanks, guys.